On a winter night in the early 1980s, in a prison camp deep inside the Soviet Union, a young woman sits alone in a freezing cell. The walls sweat ice. Her hands are raw and cracked from the cold and from the factory work she has done all day. Outside, the wind howls over the barracks in barbed wire. Inside, the guards have taken away her paper, her pencils, her books. They have forbidden her to write even a single line. She picks up a bar of cheap prison soap. Carefully, using the burnt tip of a match, she begins to scratch words into the soft, white surface. One line, then another. A metaphor drawn from the Bible, an image of light cutting through darkness. A few sharp, simple words about fear and courage and what it means to remain human when the state tries to turn you into a number. She knows that if the guards find these lines, she will be punished. So when she has memorized every word of the poem, when it is carved not only into the soap but into her mind, she walks to the tiny sink in the corner of the cell, and she washes her poem away. On the other side of the world, at that exact moment, Americans are living in a completely different reality. In living rooms across the United States, colored televisions glow with images carried by satellites. Cassette recorders capture songs off the radio. Office workers make instant copies with Xerox machines. In labs and garages, engineers and hobbyists are experimenting with personal computers, microchips, and new communications technology that will soon change the world. In one half of the Cold War, information moves freely, pushed by innovation and curiosity. In the other half, a woman is forced to write poetry on soap and then literally wash her words down the drain. Her name is Irina Ratushinskaya. She is a Soviet citizen, born in Odessa in what is now Ukraine. The government has labeled her a criminal, a threat to the state. Her crime is not espionage, not terrorism, not sabotage. Her crime is poetry. To understand why a regime would be so afraid of a poet that it sends her to a labor camp, you have to understand the fear at the heart of the Soviet system and the way that fear grew stronger every time the Kremlin looked west and saw what the United States was doing. From the very beginning of the Cold War, the Soviet leadership did not just see America as a rival military power. They saw something more unsettling, a society that embraced chaos and creativity, a place where teenagers tinkered with electronics, where journalists criticized their leaders on national television, where writers published books without asking permission from a political censor. For the Soviet state, that uncontrolled flow of ideas was almost more threatening than nuclear weapons. By the 1960s and 70s, when Irina was growing up, the gap was undeniable. Americans had put men on the moon. They were leading the world in microelectronics, computers, satellite communications, copying technology. The Soviet Union tried to match those achievements on the military side. They built rockets, submarines, warheads. But inside the country, telephones were still unreliable, photocopiers were locked in special rooms, and typewriters had to be registered with the police so that dissident texts could be traced. Technology in the USSR was allowed, but only when it could be controlled from the top down. And that is where people like Irina became so dangerous. She was born in 1954 in Odessa, a city of ships and salt air and long literary traditions. Her father was an engineer. Her mother taught Russian literature. Books filled their apartment. On paper, it looked like the ideal Soviet family, educated, useful to the state, loyal. But growing up, she could feel the tension between what the system demanded and what the human spirit craved. When it was time to choose a field of study, she made a decision that tells you a lot about her world. Instead of studying literature, the subject she loved, she chose physics. Not because she loved physics more, but because she knew that literature in the Soviet Union was suffocated by ideology. In classrooms, professors repeated the party line. Certain authors were banned. Certain questions could not be asked. Physics, she thought, might offer a little more freedom. Atoms and equations could not be censored so easily. So she entered Odessa University to study physics. But even as she worked through problem sets and lab experiments, another education was going on in parallel. She discovered the great Russian poets of the early 20th century, the so-called Silver Age: Anna Akhmatova, Osip Mandelstal, Boris Pasternak, Marina Tsveteva. Many of these poets had been censored or silenced. Some died in camps. Others were banned from publication for decades. To read them, Irina had to rely on smuggled copies, personal collections, whispered recommendations. She saw how the Soviet system tried to erase these voices from history, and how those voices survived anyway, carried in notebooks, in memory, in private recitations. It made a deep impression. By the time she graduated in the mid-1970s, Irina was already writing her own poems. They were not party slogans, they did not praise the state. They were spare, intense, and filled with Christian imagery, images of crosses, forgiveness, sacrifice, and light. In a country whose official ideology was scientific atheism, where churches were watched and believers mocked as backward, this kind of spiritual language was provocative all by itself. But that was not her only act of defiance. As a young woman, she caught the attention of the KGB, the Soviet secret police. One day, officers approached her with what they presented as a simple request: help us keep an eye on foreigners. Foreigners were rare in the Soviet Union. Tourists, students, journalists from the West were automatically suspect. The KGB wanted locals who could socialize with these visitors and report back. Who did they meet? What questions did they ask? What did they say about the country? Irina was asked to join this network of informants. In a system built on fear, many people would have quietly agreed. Refusal often meant trouble. But Irina said no. She would not spy for the secret police. She would not help build the machinery of suspicion that surrounded every outsider. The KGB did not forget. Soon after, her options within the Soviet system began to shrink. Once she finished her studies, she took a job teaching physics and mathematics at a primary school in Odessa. It was a job she loved, but even there she collided with the uglier sides of Soviet reality. In the classroom and in the corridors, she saw how Jewish pupils were treated with quiet hostility, how prejudice seeped into the system. When she spoke up about this discrimination, when she tried to defend her students, the school administration did not thank her. They fired her. Bit by bit, Irina was pushed to the margins of respectable Soviet life. It was supposed to be a warning: keep your head down, conform, stop asking questions, stop noticing things you are not supposed to see. Instead, she stepped further into opposition. In 1979, she married an engineer named Igor Geraschenko. Together, they joined a loose network of human rights activists and writers, the kind of people the Soviet press called troublemakers, parasites, spies. In reality, they were simply citizens who took their own constitution and international law seriously. Irina and Igor began to work with Samizdat, the underground press. In cramped apartments late at night, they hunched over typewriters, copying forbidden texts, novels by Alexander Solzhenitsyn, reports on political trials, religious writings, treatises on human rights. When copy machines were scarce and dangerous, they turned to photography. The couple spent countless hours photographing banned books, page by page, creating their own microfilm archives of works the state was trying to erase. By some estimates, they preserved the equivalent of 26,000 pages of forbidden literature. It was slow, tedious, risky work, but think about what it represents. In the West, by that time, massive printing presses could produce tens of thousands of books a day. Office workers could reproduce documents with the push of a button on a Xerox machine. Authors could send manuscripts to publishers by reliable mail, and later by fax. American technology made copying and transmitting information almost effortless. In the Soviet Union, two people with a camera in a kitchen were forced to do what machines did in minutes in the United States. And the state still felt threatened. Irina and Igor were not satisfied with copying books. In the early 1980s, when the great physicist and dissident Andrei Sakharov was exiled internally for criticizing the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan and the nuclear arms race, they wrote a letter to the Supreme Soviet protesting his punishment. They also did something even more audacious. In 1981, they sent an appeal to the Presidium of the Supreme Soviet of the Ukrainian Republic, urging it to introduce a constitutional amendment guaranteeing citizens the right to leave the country for permanent residence abroad. They pointed out that the USSR had signed the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights, a United Nations treaty that recognized freedom of movement. They noted that the official Soviet constitution promised certain freedoms. They asked, politely but clearly, that the law be brought into line with those promises. Coming from the United States, that may sound like a mild, even boring legal argument. In the Soviet context, it was dynamite. The KGB hauled them in. Officers shouted, threatened, waved files. "You are playing with fire," they said. "Stop now or you will face serious charges." They did not stop. Irina's poems continue to circulate in samizdat. Her name appeared under essays defending the right to emigrate, the right to believe, the right to speak. At a time when the Soviet leadership wanted to present itself to the world as a modern, technologically advanced superpower, she was quietly reminding people that under the surface lay the same old fear. In September 1982, the patience of the authorities ran out. On the 17th, KGB agents came for her. They searched her apartment, turning over drawers, pulling books off shelves, seizing manuscripts. They collected her poems, letters, copies of underground magazines. Then they put her in a car and drove her away. For months, she disappeared into the labyrinth of the Soviet penal system. Interrogations followed. Charges were prepared. In early March 1983, she was brought to trial in Kiev. The courtroom was not a place of justice. In political cases, verdicts in the Soviet Union were decided long before the judge sat down. But even so, the trial of a poet provided a kind of dark theater. The prosecutors charged her under Article 62 of the Ukrainian Soviet Criminal Code, agitation and propaganda carried out for the purpose of subverting or weakening the Soviet regime. The punishment could be up to 7 years in a strict regime labor camp and 5 more in internal exile. And what exactly was the evidence that this young woman had tried to subvert the mighty Soviet state? 6 poems. Not bombs, not blueprints, not stacks of dollars or coded messages. 6 handwritten poems, many of them full of religious symbols and reflections on suffering and hope. Prosecutors read them aloud as if they were military secrets. They argued that the spiritual language, the mentions of God, the focus on conscience and inner freedom showed contempt for the Soviet system. The poems, they claimed, undermined trust in socialist reality. They encouraged people to look beyond the earthly paradise the party promised and to place their faith in something else. In the logic of the regime, that was intolerable. Irina listened as her private reflections were twisted into crimes. Her husband later remarked that the poems were as far from politics as the Lord's Prayer, but under a system that demanded total loyalty, even a prayer could be considered an attack. On the day before her 29th birthday, the court pronounced her guilty. The sentence was the maximum, 7 years in a strict regime labor camp, followed by 5 years of internal exile. For a poet, it was a devastating blow. For the Soviet Union's image abroad, it was a catastrophe waiting to happen. She was shipped first to prison, then to the camp system in Mordovia, a region with a long history of housing political prisoners. Eventually, she arrived in a camp near a village called Barashevo. This was not just any camp. Within the barbed wire perimeter, there was a smaller, fenced-off section known as the Small Zone. It was essentially a prison inside a prison, reserved for a handful of female political prisoners, often fewer than a dozen at a time. In that small zone, where every movement was watched, where every contact with the outside world was heavily restricted, Irina began the most intense phase of her life. Her work was making gloves for Soviet workers. Day after day, she sat at a machine sewing in the cold. The food was barely enough to survive: chunks of black bread, thin fish soup that often contained more bones and smell than actual meat, weak tea. The winters were brutal, the barracks were drafty, medical care was minimal. But the worst punishment was the shizo. The shizo was a disciplinary cell, a barren, unheated concrete box. If you spoke back to a guard, if you refused to work one day, if you tried to pass a note to another prisoner, you could be sent there for days or weeks. In winter, temperatures in those cells could drop to 20, 30, even 40 degrees below zero. Prisoners were given little clothing. They were forbidden to lie down except at set hours. The food ration was smaller even than in the barracks. For a woman whose health was already fragile, shizo was a deliberate, calculated form of torture. Irina spent long stretches in those cells. Her crime, over and over, was the same: refusing to submit completely, refusing to sign false confessions, refusing to abandon her beliefs. In theory, writing was forbidden. She was not allowed pen or pencil. But for a poet, the urge to shape experience into language is as strong as the urge to breathe. That is when she devised her method with the bar of soap. Using burnt matches or a splinter of wood, she scratched verses into the soap, line by line. She would read them silently over and over until every word, every rhythm was fixed in her mind. Then she would use water to erase the evidence. Nobody could confiscate her memory. Later, when a tiny opportunity arose, when another prisoner had access to a sliver of paper, a cigarette rolling paper, a scrap from a package, she would recite the memorized poems and have them written down in the smallest possible handwriting. These tiny scripts would then be smuggled out, hidden in clothing, in food parcels, in the seams of bags. From the heart of a Soviet labor camp, through improvised human channels, her words began to travel west. In London, in New York, in Paris, editors opened envelopes and found fragile squares of paper filled with tight Cyrillic script. Translators went to work. Publishers took a chance on an unknown Soviet poet whose only public identity was a prison number. In 1984, a collection of her poetry was published abroad. More followed. English translations appeared with titles like "No, I'm Not Afraid." Readers far away from Mordovia encountered an astonishing voice, spare, unbroken, radiating hope in the face of institutional cruelty. At the same time, Irina was composing another kind of testimony, her memories of life in the small zone. Unlike many male prisoners who later wrote about politics, ideology, and grand historical forces, she focused on the tiny acts of solidarity that kept the women alive. In her memoir, which would be published later under the title "Gray is the Color of Hope," she describes how the prisoners secretly organized celebrations. When one woman had a birthday, the others would quietly save bits of sugar, grains of flour, drops of oil. They would stitch simple skirts from old bedsheets, embroider them by hand to make them festive. They would pull laurel leaves out of watery soup and weave them into makeshift victory wreaths. They would sing songs in whispers, creating a tiny island of joy in the middle of the camp. These stories humanized the abstract idea of dissident. They showed readers that behind the headlines about the Gulag were real women with humor, creativity, and stubborn faith. While she endured this, the outside world slowly but surely took notice. Amnesty International adopted her as a prisoner of conscience. The International Writers' Organization, PEN, made her case a high priority, organizing readings, petitions, and public letters. In New York, poets gathered to read her work in solidarity. Newspapers wrote editorials asking why a nuclear superpower was so afraid of a 30-year-old poet that it had to lock her away in a freezing camp.
In Western capitals, the case of Irina Ratushinskaya began to appear on the desks of politicians. Members of the U.S. Congress, already concerned about Soviet human rights abuses, mentioned her name in hearings and reports. Diplomats raised her fate in private talks. Her poetry, carried out of the USSR on scraps of paper, now came back to haunt the men in suits who had signed her arrest warrant. At the same time, the technological advantage of the West was silently amplifying her story. Western broadcasters like the BBC, Radio Liberty, and Voice of America had powerful transmitters beaming programs into Soviet territory. Listeners who dared to tune in at night, playing with the dial to avoid jamming, sometimes heard reports about political prisoners, including a young Ukrainian-born poet sentenced for her verses. The Soviet leadership had spent decades trying to jam these signals, flooding the airwaves with noise. But as transmitters grew more powerful, as frequencies multiplied, as satellite connections improved, jamming became harder and more expensive. Every time a Soviet citizen heard Irina's name on a foreign broadcast, every time a rumor about her spread beyond the official press, the state's monopoly on truth cracked a little more. By the mid-1980s, the Kremlin was facing a serious dilemma. On paper, the Soviet Union was a superpower. It fielded enormous tank armies, nuclear submarines, ICMs, but its economy was stagnating. Its computer industry lagged years behind America's. Its ability to innovate was crushed by bureaucracy and fear. In Washington, by contrast, microchips shrank and gained speed every year. American scientists and companies were developing stealth aircraft, advanced missiles, early versions of the technologies that would one day become the Internet. The Persian Gulf War, still a few years away, would soon show just how wide the technological gap had grown. To modernize, the USSR needed access to Western technology and trade. It needed credits, machines, joint ventures, and to get those, it needed to improve its image. This was the background when a new Soviet leader, Mikhail Gorbachev, came to power in 1985. He introduced words like glasnost, openness, and perestroika, restructuring, into the Soviet political vocabulary. He told the world he wanted to reform the system, to reduce tensions, to negotiate real arms reductions with the United States. But as long as people like Irina were rotting in camps for writing poetry, his talk of openness sounded hollow. In October 1986, a high-stakes meeting was scheduled between Gorbachev and President Ronald Reagan in Reykjavik, Iceland. The agenda was dominated by nuclear weapons and ballistic missile defense. The eyes of the world were on these two men and their respective visions of the future. On the eve of that summit, something unexpected happened. Irina, by then transferred from the camp back to Kiev, was summoned by prison authorities. A general from the KGB, Yuri Marchuk, informed her that a special decree had been signed. Her sentence was being cut short. She was to be released and allowed to go home. After years of lies and psychological games, she was understandably skeptical. She thought it might be a trick, another transfer, some new twist in the endless punishment. But it was real. On October 9, 1986, she walked out of captivity. The timing was no accident. Within days, Gorbachev and Reagan would sit across from each other in Reykjavik. The Soviet leader wanted to show good faith on human rights, to give Western journalists a positive story to balance the grim memories of the Gulag. Freeing a well-known political prisoner, a poet adopted by Amnesty and PEN, was a relatively low-cost way to do that. For the United States, Irina's release was evidence that pressure worked. A combination of moral outrage, political lobbying, and the quiet but constant force of Western media and technology had reached into the heart of the Soviet prison system and pulled one person out. But from Irina's perspective, the larger system had not changed nearly enough. She later compared Gorbachev to a dentist treating a tooth in a cancer patient. Perhaps he could alleviate some symptoms, but the underlying disease remained. Soon after, she and her husband were allowed to leave the Soviet Union on a medical visa. They flew to the West. The country that had sentenced her for poems now stripped her of citizenship. In 1987, she took up a position as poet in residence at Northwestern University in Illinois. Imagine the contrast. Only a short time before, she had been scribbling lines into soap in a freezing cell. Now she was teaching and reading her work in an American university, surrounded by students who could protest, publish, and travel with a freedom she had only dreamed of. On campus, Xerox machines hummed in the background, copying articles that criticized the president, the CIA, the Pentagon. Computers buzzed in labs where researchers pushed forward in physics and engineering. In libraries, shelves sagged under the weight of books by authors who had never had to ask a censor for permission. For Irina, the United States was proof that technology and freedom could reinforce each other instead of canceling each other out. She published her memoir of the camp, Gray is the Color of Hope, in English. Readers around the world met the women of the small zone in Mordovia. They read about makeshift birthday parties, about standing in lines in the snow for the privilege of a short walk, about the taste of watery soup and the sound of keys in the lock at night. She also wrote another memoir, In the Beginning, about her childhood, her university years, her early clashes with the KGB, and she continued to publish poetry and later novels set in Odessa and in the complicated, half-free, half-trapped world of the post-Soviet 1990s. In the late 1990s, Irina and Igor made a decision that surprised some of their friends in the West. They moved back to Russia. The Soviet Union had collapsed, the red flags had come down, the KGB had changed its name. On paper, there was no longer any law that could send a poet to a camp for 6 lines of verse. But Irina remained wary. She continued to speak out about the lingering culture of fear, the temptation of power to rewrite history. She lived long enough to see her story become part of a larger narrative about the end of the Cold War, not just a story about tanks and treaties, but about the power of words and memory and technology combined. Because in the end, her life tells us something crucial about that global conflict. The Cold War was not won simply because one side built more missiles than the other. It was not decided solely by the size of defense budgets or the number of divisions on each side of the Iron Curtain. It was shaped by the way each system treated its own citizens and its own information. On one side, a government so afraid of independent thought that it sent a 29-year-old poet to a freezing camp for writing about God. On the other side, a society that allowed poets to criticize their leaders on national television, that let dissidents and activists operate openly, that turned technology into a tool for sharing information rather than for controlling it. When Irina carved poems into soap, she was doing an act of resistance. When Americans built transmitters that carried her words back into the Soviet Union, when American universities gave her a stage, when American readers bought her books, they were participating in a different kind of arms race. In that race, the most powerful weapons were not warheads, but ideas. For Americans watching her story today, there is a particular kind of pride that comes from recognizing this. Pride in the engineers who developed the communication systems that rendered censorship obsolete. Pride in the lawmakers who linked trade to human rights and refused to stay silent. Pride in ordinary citizens who wrote letters, attended readings, sent donations to organizations defending people they would never meet.
But there is also something else, a sense of responsibility. Irina Ratushinskaya's life reminds us how fragile freedom of expression can be and how quickly technology can be turned to either liberate or control. In the United States, the same tools that once helped bypass jamming and spread Samizdat now form social networks, video platforms, and instant messaging systems. They can be used to expose tyranny or to amplify lies.
In the end, the woman in that freezing cell and the teenager in an American garage wiring together a homemade computer were part of the same global story. One endured the full weight of a system that feared words. The other helped build a world in which those words could travel at the speed of light. The Soviet Union tried to keep up with the United States in rockets and tanks, but it never understood that its greatest vulnerability was not lagging microchips or leaky pipelines. Its greatest vulnerability was the human conscience. Every time someone like Irina refused to become an informer, refused to renounce her faith, refused to stop writing, the edifice of control cracked. Every time a Western broadcaster, using the latest transmission technology, sent her name into Soviet homes, the myth of all-powerful censorship weakened. When the Soviet Union finally collapsed, it did so under the weight of economic failure, military overstretch, and political stagnation. But it also collapsed because millions of people, inspired by stories like Irina's, had silently stopped believing in the lies. For a girl in Odessa who chose physics to avoid propaganda, for a prisoner writing on soap, for a poet in residence in Illinois, this arc of history was deeply personal. For Americans looking back on the Cold War, it is a reminder that the contest between two systems was never just about which one could build the bigger bomb. It was about which one trusted its citizens with the truth.